Today, we find ourselves at a crossroads in history as we discuss a turning point that has profound implications for the future. The world has long debated the dynamics of aid, sovereignty, and self-sufficiency. The phrase "Traoré stays no more Western help" signifies a pivotal moment in this ongoing conversation. This is not just the withdrawal of foreign aid or the cessation of Western support to a single nation. It's a declaration, a statement of intent. It's a reaffirmation of the belief that nations should not rely on external forces to determine their futures, that the strength of a people, their culture, their resources, and their ability to overcome challenges should not be dependent on the whims of distant powers. When we look at countries across the world, there has been an ongoing narrative of dependency, a cycle where aid becomes less about uplifting nations and more about maintaining influence. The term Traoré here symbolizes a leader, a movement, or perhaps a moment that has emerged to challenge this cycle. It represents the voice of those who say, "We are capable, we can stand on our own, we can chart our path without interference." This is not an anti-Western sentiment. It's a call for a more balanced and fair partnership between the global South and the global North. It is a plea for a world where nations are not kept in a perpetual state of assistance, but empowered to develop, innovate, and lead. For too long, Western help has been a double-edged sword. While it has brought much-needed resources, technology, and expertise, it has also often come with strings attached. These strings have sometimes limited autonomy, skewed priorities, and fostered a reliance that leaves nations vulnerable. Traoré stays no more speaks to the need for a future where sovereignty is respected and where nations are given the freedom to define their own progress. However, this shift doesn't imply isolationism or self-sufficiency at all costs. It calls for collaboration. It calls for partnerships that recognize the diverse needs and unique strengths of each nation. Rather than a charity-based system, we need a more equitable global framework, one that allows all nations to thrive and contribute to a common good. In a world that is increasingly interconnected, it's time to rethink the paradigms of aid, power, and influence. Traoré stays no more Western help is not the end of cooperation between nations. Rather, it signals a new era where independence, respect, and equality define our relationships. It's a world where all nations, regardless of size or history, can determine their destiny with dignity. In closing, as we witness this moment in time, let us remember that true progress is not measured by the amount of help given, but by the capacity of a nation to stand tall, to lead, and to contribute to a better world. A world where no one is dependent, but everyone is empowered. The phrase "Traoré stays no more Western help" marks a critical juncture in the global discourse on aid, sovereignty, and self-determination. At its core, it symbolizes a call for nations, particularly those in the global South, to reclaim control over their futures and cease being reliant on foreign assistance. In a world where international aid has long been a key factor in development, the idea that nations should be self-sufficient is a radical yet necessary shift in perspective. For decades, many countries have found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependency, where external aid, whether financial, humanitarian, or technical, becomes an ongoing necessity. This dependency, while well-intentioned in its origins, has often led to unintended consequences. Nations that receive aid may find themselves constrained by the priorities of donor countries, their own needs sidelined in favor of external interests. In the worst cases, this dependency can perpetuate a sense of powerlessness and hinder genuine development. By embracing the principle of sovereignty and self-sufficiency, the argument is that nations should have the autonomy to make decisions that align with their unique needs, values, and goals, rather than being subject to the dictates of foreign powers. Sovereignty in this context does not just refer to political independence, but also to the ability to determine one's own economic and social future. This is a fundamental shift, one that acknowledges the complexities of aid relationships while advocating for a more empowering and sustainable path for nations. In many parts of the world, countries have shown remarkable resilience and innovation in the face of challenges, even without substantial foreign assistance. The idea that nations can thrive independently is not utopian. It's grounded in the belief that with the right resources, governance, and internal systems, countries can chart their own development path. For example, local solutions to climate change, technology, education, and healthcare have emerged in several nations, often driven by local leaders and communities who understand their specific needs better than any external actor could. The notion of self-sufficiency encourages nations to harness their own strengths and resources, creating homegrown solutions that are both sustainable and culturally appropriate. Moreover, reducing reliance on foreign aid allows for a greater focus on internal reforms and improvements. By managing their own economies and directing resources toward local industries, nations can create a more resilient economic structure that doesn't depend on the uncertainties of international markets or donor priorities. This also means prioritizing long-term development goals that reflect the needs and aspirations of the local population, rather than short-term fixes that may come with conditions that do not align with national interests. Sovereignty in this context is also linked to cultural independence. Many nations that have relied heavily on Western aid have found their cultures and traditions sidelined in favor of foreign norms. This may occur inadvertently through the imposition of Western systems, values, or even development models that may not be compatible with the local way of life. The call for sovereignty, therefore, extends beyond political and economic freedom. It is also about protecting cultural identities and values from external influence. Each country, community, and society should have the right to determine how they want to develop and define themselves without outside interference or imposition. Furthermore, fostering self-sufficiency also involves strengthening local institutions, governance structures, and capacities. One of the criticisms of external aid is that it sometimes weakens local governance systems. When aid is provided without a clear strategy for empowering local leadership and institutions, it can lead to dependency not only on external resources but also on external management and expertise. This undermines the very leadership that is needed for sustainable change. Self-sufficiency, then, is about capacity building within nations so that local governments, businesses, and communities have the tools, knowledge, and leadership to address their own challenges. However, this vision of self-sufficiency does not suggest that nations should completely isolate themselves or reject all forms of external cooperation. Rather, it calls for a more balanced approach to international engagement. Global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and geopolitical tensions require collaborative solutions. But collaboration should not mean subjugation. It should be about mutual respect and partnership, where nations work together as equals, sharing knowledge, resources, and innovations in ways that are beneficial for all. One important point here is that sovereignty and self-sufficiency do not imply an unwillingness to receive help or engage with the global community. They are about reshaping the terms of that engagement, ensuring that aid is not a permanent crutch, but a catalyst for self-reliance. Assistance should be geared toward building infrastructure, institutions, and systems that enable nations to stand on their own feet, rather than providing temporary solutions that leave countries vulnerable in the long run. The message that Traoré stays no more Western help is not an outright rejection of foreign cooperation. It is in fact a clarion call for a world where nations do not need to rely on the goodwill or generosity of others to survive and thrive. It is a vision where countries, especially those in the global south, can control their own destinies, empower their people, and build sustainable futures. Ultimately, the goal is not merely to end external assistance, but to ensure that it is no longer needed because countries can provide for themselves with dignity, independence, and a renewed sense of agency. For decades, foreign aid has been viewed as a necessary lifeline for many countries in the global south. It has been an essential component in the fight against poverty, disease, and inequality. However, over time, there has emerged a growing recognition that aid, while often well-intentioned, has not always achieved its desired goals. In fact, it has sometimes perpetuated a cycle of dependency, where nations become reliant on foreign assistance to meet their basic needs. The call to break the cycle of dependency is not an attack on aid, but rather a challenge to the structures and dynamics that have kept nations in this state of reliance. The historical roots of this dependency are tied to the colonial era, during which many countries were economically and politically subjugated by imperial powers. When the colonizers left, they often left behind weak institutions and economies that were not equipped to thrive on their own. In the years that followed, foreign aid, initially seen as a means of reconstructing these nations, quickly became a dominant feature of their development models. The promise was that aid would lift countries out of poverty, build infrastructure, and help establish basic services like healthcare and education. But what was intended to be a temporary measure to rebuild war-torn or impoverished nations has, in many instances, turned into an ongoing dependency. This dependency, unfortunately, has often hindered the very autonomy that these countries need to thrive. Aid has become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings immediate relief and much-needed resources. On the other, it can constrain a country's sovereignty and capacity for self-determination. In many cases, aid is tied to conditions that favor the interests of donor countries rather than the priorities of the recipient nations. Donor nations often expect recipient countries to align with their economic or political agendas, making aid a tool not of empowerment, but of influence and control. This can undermine local governance and decision-making, as nations feel pressured to comply with external demands in order to continue receiving assistance. Additionally, the influx of foreign aid has sometimes contributed to the erosion of local industries. When a country receives aid, particularly in the form of goods or food, local producers often cannot compete with the influx of cheap goods, which are sometimes subsidized by the donor country. This can stifle local economic development and create a cycle where the country becomes less capable of producing its own goods and services. The aid, instead of stimulating self-reliance, can perpetuate the need for more assistance, as it delays or prevents the development of local industries and economies. Moreover, aid-dependent countries often face political instability and corruption, as foreign assistance can become a source of political power. Leaders may manipulate aid to maintain their position, using the resources to appease certain groups or consolidate their authority. This undermines the democratic process and prevents the emergence of strong, transparent institutions that are essential for long-term stability. In the absence of strong institutions, aid can sometimes inadvertently support a system that favors the elite, leaving the general population in a state of perpetual poverty and disenfranchisement. The call to break the cycle of dependency, therefore, is a call for structural change. It is about creating an environment where nations can stand on their own without the need for constant assistance. This does not mean rejecting all forms of cooperation or support, but rather moving away from the mindset that development is only possible through foreign aid. The goal is to empower nations to develop their own capacities, to build strong institutions, and to create sustainable systems that can meet the needs of their populations without relying on external help. In practical terms, breaking the cycle of dependency means investing in local resources and industries. It means developing infrastructure that enables economic self-sufficiency, such as education systems that produce skilled workers, industries that can produce goods locally, and agricultural systems that ensure food security. It also means prioritizing investments that strengthen governance, reduce corruption, and promote accountability. Rather than receiving aid to solve specific problems in the short term, the focus should be on creating long-term solutions that enable nations to generate their own resources and manage their own affairs. Another crucial aspect of challenging dependency is the shift in mindset. Both donor and recipient countries must move away from the idea that aid is the solution to all development problems. The traditional model of aid, where one nation gives money or resources to another, often ignores the realities on the ground and fails to engage with the complexities of local contexts. The new paradigm should emphasize partnerships, where the focus is on shared knowledge, capacity building, and sustainable projects that prioritize the autonomy of the recipient nations. Instead of merely transferring resources, the relationship should involve collaboration on creating lasting solutions, allowing countries to chart their own path forward. Breaking the cycle of dependency also requires challenging the structural inequalities that perpetuate poverty in the first place. These include global trade systems that favor wealthy nations, the exploitation of natural resources in the global south, and the dominance of multinational corporations that undermine local economies. By addressing these systemic issues, countries in the global south can begin to create more equitable economic systems that are less reliant on foreign aid and more focused on local growth and development. Ultimately, the goal of moving away from dependency is to empower nations to take control of their own development. It is a vision of the future where countries are not reliant on handouts from the West, but instead have the capacity to address their own challenges, innovate, and contribute to global progress. This process will not be easy and will require a long-term commitment from both governments and international organizations to ensure that support is provided in a way that fosters independence and sustainability rather than continued dependence. In conclusion, the call to break the cycle of dependency is a call for change. It is about empowering nations to become self-reliant, to develop their own solutions, and to regain control over their futures. It requires a rethinking of the aid system, focusing on partnership and collaboration, and investing in local capacity building rather than creating an endless cycle of dependence. Only by challenging this cycle can we move towards a world where nations, regardless of their past, are empowered to shape their own destinies. In the context of contemporary global politics, there is an increasing recognition of the importance of local leadership and self-determination. Leaders like Traoré are at the forefront of movements that are advocating for a shift in how nations and communities engage with both internal and external forces. These leaders understand that true progress begins with trusting in the capabilities of local governments, communities, and people to find their own solutions to the challenges they face. By reaffirming the power of local leadership, they are challenging the traditional view that outside expertise or foreign intervention is always the answer. Instead, they are calling for the empowerment of local institutions and individuals who have the knowledge, experience, and investment in their communities to drive sustainable change. The notion of self-determination has long been a powerful force in the struggle for independence and autonomy, especially in regions that have historically been colonized or subjugated. For many nations, the legacy of colonialism left them with fragmented political systems, economies that were not designed for self-sufficiency, and societies where local leadership was often undermined or ignored. The external imposition of foreign aid and development models often furthered this marginalization, suggesting that local leadership was insufficient or incapable of addressing complex national issues. However, leaders like Traoré have emerged to challenge this narrative, asserting that local leadership is not only capable, but essential for long-term development. One of the most compelling aspects of reaffirming local leadership is the recognition that no one understands the challenges of a community or nation better than the people who live there. Local leaders, whether they are politicians, activists, or community organizers, are often deeply embedded in the social, cultural, and economic fabric of their societies. They have a lived understanding of the issues their people face, whether it's poverty, unemployment, health crises, or environmental degradation. Unlike foreign experts or international organizations, local leaders are not distanced from the day-to-day struggles of the people they represent. Their decisions are shaped by a deep commitment to improving the lives of their fellow citizens, which is why they are often best placed to craft solutions that are relevant, sustainable, and culturally appropriate. Trusting in local leadership also means acknowledging the importance of local knowledge systems and indigenous practices that have long been overlooked in favor of external expertise. Indigenous knowledge about agriculture, climate resilience, healthcare, and governance has been passed down through generations, yet it is frequently dismissed in favor of Western approaches to development. By reaffirming the power of local leadership, communities can tap into these knowledge systems and integrate them with modern strategies for progress. This does not mean rejecting all forms of external assistance or innovation. Rather, it's about finding a balanced approach that incorporates the best of both worlds. In many countries, local governments and community leaders already have the networks and structures in place to address national issues, but they often lack the resources, recognition, or political will to do so. Leaders like Traoré seek to empower these local institutions, encouraging them to take a more central role in the decision-making processes that shape their country's future. The decentralization of power from central governments to local authorities can foster a more inclusive, responsive, and accountable political system. Local governments, being closer to the people, are better able to respond to their specific needs and are more likely to be held accountable for their actions. The empowerment of local leadership also involves building the capacity of these leaders to take on larger roles in national development. It is not enough to simply trust in local leadership if those leaders lack the resources, training, or access to information they need to succeed. This is why the focus on empowering local governments and communities must also include investments in education, governance, and leadership development. By providing local leaders with the tools they need to succeed, we can ensure that they are equipped to navigate the complexities of modern governance and development. This will help create a generation of leaders who are not just advocates for their communities, but are also capable of managing the resources, systems, and institutions that will drive long-term national progress. In this process, external actors, whether foreign governments, international organizations, or private sector players, must recognize their role as partners, not paternalistic overseers. Rather than imposing solutions from the outside, the international community must support local leaders in their efforts to take charge of their own destinies. This involves listening to local voices, respecting local priorities, and providing support in the form of capacity building, technical assistance, and fair trade practices. The international community must shift from a model of aid dependency to one of partnership, where local leadership is supported, not supplanted. Reaffirming the power of local leadership also means reimagining the role of civil society. Non-governmental organizations, grassroots movements, and community-based groups play an integral role in shaping the political and social landscape of many nations. These organizations often fill the gaps left by weak state institutions, providing services, advocating for marginalized groups, and holding governments accountable. The strength of civil society in many developing countries demonstrates that leadership is not confined to elected officials or politicians alone. It exists in every corner of society. Local leaders, both formal and informal, must be seen as integral to the development process, and their contributions should be recognized and supported. Another key aspect of reaffirming local leadership is the need for a shift in development priorities. The traditional development model has often focused on large-scale top-down solutions that are driven by international institutions and external stakeholders. These solutions, while well-meaning, can fail to take into account the unique cultural, social, and economic realities of the communities they aim to help. By empowering local leaders and communities to define their own development goals, we can create solutions that are more tailored, effective, and sustainable. This approach recognizes that development is not a one-size-fits-all process, but one that must be rooted in the specific needs, values, and aspirations of local populations. Ultimately, reaffirming the power of local leadership is about reclaiming agency, independence, and dignity. It is a recognition that local leaders, communities, and governments have the capacity to drive their own development, shape their own futures, and create lasting change. By trusting in local leadership, we are investing in the future of nations, building systems, institutions, and societies that are sustainable, resilient, and capable of facing the challenges of an increasingly complex world. This shift will not happen overnight, but with the right investments in local governance, education, and civil society, we can create a future where communities are empowered to lead and nations are capable of realizing their full potential. The idea that the withdrawal of Western help does not signal isolation, but rather a shift toward more equitable partnerships, is an essential concept in the evolving dynamics of global relations. For too long, the model of international aid has been rooted in an imbalanced system, where wealthier nations provided assistance to developing countries under terms that often reflected the interests of the donors more than those of the recipients. The withdrawal of aid, particularly from Western powers, offers an opportunity for rethinking these relationships and exploring alternative models of collaboration that are based on mutual respect, fairness, and a deeper understanding of each nation's unique strengths and needs. This shift is not about severing ties or turning away from international cooperation, but about creating a more level playing field where all parties engage as equals in a relationship that is mutually beneficial. Historically, Western aid has often been seen as a tool for maintaining influence rather than fostering true development. Aid packages, loans, and investments from Western countries have frequently been accompanied by conditions that benefit the donor nations, whether through access to natural resources, markets, or geopolitical leverage. While aid has undoubtedly been essential in alleviating immediate hardships and addressing critical issues, it has also contributed to an ongoing cycle of dependency. Countries in the global south, while receiving financial and technical assistance, often find themselves trapped in a system where their sovereignty is compromised and their ability to make independent decisions is limited. The shift away from this model calls for a reimagining of global partnerships that are rooted in equity, respect, and shared responsibility. Reworking global partnerships is not about rejecting cooperation with the West or other global players, but about finding a more balanced and sustainable approach to international relations. It's about recognizing that every country, regardless of its level of development or wealth, has valuable knowledge, resources, and perspectives to contribute to global solutions. By shifting the focus from aid to partnership, Nations in the global south are no longer recipients of charity, but active participants in shaping the global order. In this new framework, partnerships are based on shared goals, where all parties work together to address common challenges such as climate change, poverty, education, and healthcare. One of the central elements of this reworking is the acknowledgement that the needs of different countries are diverse and cannot be addressed with a one-size-fits-all approach. A more equitable partnership recognizes the specific strengths and challenges that each nation faces. For instance, while some countries may have advanced infrastructure and technology sectors, others may have rich natural resources or strong local knowledge systems. A true partnership leverages these unique assets in a way that benefits all parties involved. Instead of imposing standardized solutions or external models of development, global cooperation should be about respecting and harnessing the individual characteristics of each country, helping them build on their strengths while addressing their specific challenges. Moreover, reworking global partnerships involves a shift away from the traditional donor-recipient model. In this new paradigm, countries that have historically been aid recipients can share their knowledge and experiences with others, fostering a more collaborative and less hierarchical approach. Countries that have successfully overcome challenges such as poverty, disease, or political instability have valuable lessons to impart. Their experiences can help other nations navigate similar obstacles, promoting a sense of solidarity and shared progress. This form of partnership is not about dependency, but about mutual learning and support, where all nations contribute to the collective knowledge and capacity of the global community. This shift also emphasizes the importance of respecting sovereignty and local governance. Historically, Western aid has often come with strings attached, requiring countries to align their policies with donor expectations or to adopt specific economic or political systems. This has often led to a situation where aid flows are tied to the political and economic interests of the donor nations rather than the needs of the recipient countries. In contrast, reworking global partnerships calls for a more flexible and respectful approach, where nations have the freedom to choose their own paths while engaging in constructive dialogue with international partners. This shift fosters greater ownership over development processes, allowing nations to determine their own priorities and strategies without external pressures. Another key aspect of reworking global partnerships is addressing the structural inequalities that have historically shaped international relations. For many years, the global economic system has been skewed in favor of wealthy countries with multinational corporations and financial institutions, often exploiting the resources of poorer nations without providing fair returns. This exploitation has perpetuated cycles of poverty and underdevelopment in many parts of the world. A more equitable partnership seeks to address these disparities by creating fairer trade relationships, encouraging responsible investment, and ensuring that the benefits of global cooperation are more evenly distributed. This means advocating for reforms in global trade systems, promoting fair labor practices, and ensuring that the voices of marginalized communities are heard in decision-making processes. Reworking global partnerships also requires a shift in the way foreign aid is conceptualized. Rather than seeing aid as a one-way flow of resources from donor to recipient, partnerships should focus on long-term collaboration that builds sustainable systems and institutions. This could include joint research and innovation initiatives, technology transfers, and shared efforts to address global challenges like climate change, disease, and economic inequality. In such partnerships, each country brings something to the table, whether it's technological expertise, financial resources, or local knowledge, and works together to find solutions that benefit everyone involved. At the heart of reworking global partnerships is the recognition that no country can tackle the world's most pressing issues in isolation. Global challenges require collective action, and the success of these efforts depends on the willingness of all countries to work together as equals. By creating partnerships that are rooted in mutual respect and fairness, nations can move beyond the traditional power dynamics that have often defined international relations. This means recognizing that every nation, regardless of its size or wealth, has the right to shape its own future and contribute to the global community in meaningful ways. Ultimately, the goal of reworking global partnerships is to create a more just and inclusive international system where all countries have the opportunity to thrive. This is a world where collaboration is based on shared values, equitable relationships, and a deep understanding of each nation's unique strengths and needs. It's a world where cooperation is not about charity or dominance, but about solidarity and mutual benefit. By moving away from the traditional aid model and embracing more equitable partnerships, the global community can create a future that is more sustainable, resilient, and fair for all. The historical narrative of foreign aid, particularly from Western nations, has often been fraught with complexities that go beyond mere generosity. Aid, while beneficial in addressing immediate crises and alleviating hardship, has frequently come with significant strings attached. Strings that tie the recipient nations to political, economic, or cultural conditions that reflect the interests and priorities of the donor countries. These strings have often resulted in a situation where aid, instead of empowering nations to make independent decisions and chart their own developmental path, has inadvertently perpetuated the influence and control of donor countries. As a result, many countries in the global south have become entangled in a system where their sovereignty is compromised, their domestic policies shaped by external powers, and their cultural identities eroded by the pressures to conform to Western norms. Moving beyond aid as a tool of influence, therefore, is not just about ending assistance, but about reimagining the way global cooperation functions, creating systems of genuine collaboration that respect the autonomy and sovereignty of all nations. Foreign aid in its traditional form has often been tied to specific political or economic expectations. The most prominent example of this can be seen in the conditionality attached to World Bank and International Monetary Fund (IMF) loans, where countries seeking financial assistance are often required to adopt certain economic policies. These conditions can range from structural adjustment programs to austerity measures, trade liberalization, and privatization of state assets. While these policies may benefit the donor countries or international corporations, they are not always aligned with the developmental priorities of the recipient nations. The result is that countries may be forced to make policy decisions that prioritize foreign interests over the needs of their own citizens. This form of aid is not truly developmental in nature, but rather a mechanism for advancing the political and economic agendas of the donor countries. Moreover, Western aid has often been a vehicle for promoting cultural values and systems of governance that may not always be in harmony with the local customs, traditions, or historical context of the recipient nation. The imposition of Western-style democratic systems, education models, or market-driven economies can sometimes be a form of cultural imperialism, undermining indigenous knowledge systems and local governance structures that have worked for centuries. In many cases, the push for Westernization, backed by financial assistance, has created tensions, destabilized societies, and weakened local institutions that were better suited to the realities of their context. Instead of fostering mutual understanding and respect, this form of aid has sometimes acted as a tool of cultural domination, where the local population is expected to conform to foreign norms, often at the expense of their own values and identities. A major aspect of moving beyond aid as a tool of influence is the recognition that genuine development cannot be imposed from the outside. Development is a deeply local process, and for it to be sustainable, it must be driven by the people, communities and governments of the countries in question. Rather than being subjected to top-down mandates from external powers, countries should be empowered to decide their own path based on their own priorities, needs and resources. This requires a fundamental shift away from the paternalistic nature of traditional aid, where donor countries or international institutions dictate terms and conditions. Instead, a system of aid that fosters genuine collaboration would be based on mutual respect, transparency, and a shared commitment to long-term goals. In this new framework, foreign assistance would no longer be viewed as a form of charity or a means of exerting influence, but rather as a catalyst for building capacity, strengthening local institutions, and promoting self-sufficiency. This type of assistance would be designed to support countries in achieving their own developmental objectives without imposing external agendas. For example, instead of pushing for the privatization of state-owned enterprises or the adoption of specific economic models, international partners could focus on providing technical assistance, knowledge sharing, and capacity-building initiatives that help governments and communities build the systems they need to thrive. The goal would be to foster local ownership of development processes, ensuring that countries have the tools and resources to solve their own problems, rather than relying on outside interventions. Equally important is the need for a shift in the way international relations are structured. In many cases, Western countries have used aid as a means to maintain geopolitical influence, secure access to natural resources, or open markets for their goods and services. By reworking the system of foreign aid, countries can move away from the transactional nature of these relationships and create more equitable, reciprocal partnerships. The new model would emphasize shared interests and mutual benefit, where countries cooperate based on a genuine desire to improve the well-being of all involved, rather than advancing narrow political or economic goals. A key element of this shift is the promotion of fair trade and economic justice. For too long, the global trade system has been tilted in favor of wealthy countries and multinational corporations. Many countries in the global south have been forced to accept unfavorable trade terms, often exporting raw materials while importing finished goods, which reinforces their dependence on wealthier nations. Moving beyond aid as a tool of influence means advocating for a more just global economic system, one that ensures fair prices for goods, sustainable development, and reduces the dominance of multinational corporations. This would enable countries to have more control over their own economies, create better paying jobs, and reduce the need for external aid. The push for moving beyond aid also involves rethinking how we view the role of external actors in the development process. Rather than viewing international organizations, donor governments, or NGOs as the primary agents of change, the focus should be on empowering local leaders, institutions, and communities to take charge of their own development. This can be achieved by supporting grassroots movements, local entrepreneurs, and civil society organizations that are already working to address the challenges their communities face. The role of external actors should be one of support and collaboration, not domination or control. The aim is to create a world where development is driven by local needs, local solutions, and local leadership, with external support provided in a way that respects and amplifies these efforts rather than undermining them. In this new system, countries no longer need to rely on foreign aid to meet their needs or achieve their goals. Instead, they can work together with international partners to create sustainable, inclusive development models that are grounded in local realities and are built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared responsibility. Ultimately, moving beyond aid as a tool of influence is about creating a new paradigm for global cooperation, one that is based on dignity, fairness, and the recognition of each country's right to determine its own future. This shift requires the dismantling of old power structures, the rejection of aid dependency, and the creation of partnerships that prioritize the needs and aspirations of people, rather than the interests of external powers. In doing so, we can build a more just and equitable global community, where nations are no longer subjects of external influence, but active participants in shaping a shared future. True progress, when examined in its most sustainable and long-term form, cannot rely solely on the perpetual flow of external aid. While aid may serve as a temporary relief during crises or provide initial support in building essential infrastructure, its role cannot be that of a permanent solution. The real measure of progress for any nation lies in its capacity to harness its own resources, cultivate its own skills, and build a robust, self-sufficient infrastructure that can endure the test of time. The goal, therefore, should be to empower nations in such a way that they no longer rely on external aid, but become capable of driving their own development. This would allow them to not only thrive independently, but also contribute meaningfully to the global community, fostering a system where each country is a partner in a collective global effort, rather than a dependent recipient. Historically, foreign aid has been viewed as a necessary tool for alleviating poverty and accelerating development. In many cases, aid has been essential in providing the initial resources needed to address critical needs, whether in the form of food aid, health interventions, or emergency assistance following natural disasters. However, the continuous reliance on aid as a developmental strategy creates a cycle of dependency, where nations become accustomed to receiving resources and support from external actors without necessarily developing the capacity to solve their own problems. This ongoing dependence can prevent countries from building the internal mechanisms necessary for growth and self-sustainability. Rather than encouraging innovation, local ownership, and the development of long-term solutions, aid can, in some cases, hinder a nation's ability to create its own future. Empowering nations for sustainable progress requires a paradigm shift that focuses on building internal capacity. This means investing in human capital through education, healthcare, and skill development to ensure that future generations are equipped with the knowledge and tools to solve the problems their countries face. It also involves strengthening the economic infrastructure of nations, helping them to become producers rather than just consumers in the global economy. By developing local industries and creating employment opportunities, countries can begin to reduce their dependency on foreign products and services, which will strengthen their economies and provide them with the resources they need to fund their own development. Additionally, empowering nations means investing in innovation and technological advancements that are tailored to the specific needs of a country or region. Many developing nations have unique environmental, social, and economic challenges that require bespoke solutions. Instead of relying on external technologies or solutions that may not be suited to local contexts, countries should be encouraged to develop their own innovations. These innovations could be in agriculture, healthcare, energy, or infrastructure, areas that are critical to long-term development. Encouraging local entrepreneurship, fostering innovation hubs, and supporting research and development initiatives within countries can create a dynamic ecosystem where nations can continuously adapt to new challenges without relying on external help. A significant part of this process also involves developing strong institutions and governance systems that are capable of managing resources, creating and enforcing laws, and ensuring the equitable distribution of wealth. Effective governance ensures that resources are used efficiently and transparently, minimizing corruption and creating an environment where citizens can trust their leaders to act in the national interest. When governance is weak, it's difficult for nations to develop independently, as they often become susceptible to external influence and exploitation. Strengthening local institutions ensures that countries are equipped to manage their own development and respond to both domestic and global challenges with resilience. Another critical aspect of empowering nations is ensuring that countries have the infrastructure they need to support economic and social progress. This includes not only physical infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and utilities, but also digital infrastructure, which is increasingly essential in the modern world. Access to technology, the internet, and digital tools can enable countries to participate more fully in the global economy, improve their educational systems, and provide better healthcare services. Without the necessary infrastructure, countries will struggle to move beyond a state of dependency and will remain limited in their ability to harness the potential of their populations. Sustainable development also requires an environmental dimension, one that ensures nations do not sacrifice their long-term health and resources in the name of short-term economic growth. Empowering nations for sustainable progress means promoting green technologies, renewable energy solutions, and agricultural practices that protect the environment while contributing to the economy. Climate change poses a significant challenge, especially for developing nations that are disproportionately affected by its impact. Therefore, empowering countries to create resilient and adaptive systems in the face of environmental challenges is crucial. Countries that are able to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability are better positioned to thrive independently and can contribute to the global effort of mitigating climate change. Furthermore, empowerment must extend beyond national borders. No country is an island in today's interconnected world, and collaboration with other nations is essential for addressing global challenges. However, this collaboration should not be one-sided, with the wealthier nations dominating the conversation and imposing their solutions. Instead, it should be based on mutual respect, where nations collaborate on an equal footing to tackle global issues such as climate change, inequality, health crises, and economic instability. This kind of collaboration should emphasize shared learning, knowledge exchange, and partnerships that promote mutual growth and benefit. The ultimate objective of empowering nations for sustainable progress is to create an international system where all countries, regardless of their current developmental status, are capable of independently solving their own challenges. This doesn't mean that nations will stop collaborating or that they will no longer need external assistance in times of crisis. Rather, it means that the need for aid will diminish as countries develop the internal capabilities to support their own populations, solve their own problems, and contribute to the broader global community. This is a vision of a world where development is not about dependency, but about resilience, innovation, and collaboration, where nations support one another, not out of necessity, but because they are equals in a shared commitment to a better future. As countries develop the ability to generate their own resources and solutions, they will no longer need to rely on others for survival. They will be able to shape their own destinies, contributing to a more balanced, fair, and sustainable global community. This empowerment will create a ripple effect, inspiring future generations of leaders and citizens to work toward a world where self-sufficiency and mutual respect are the cornerstones of progress. The path to this future is long and requires significant investment in people, systems, and infrastructure, but it is a journey that can transform nations and the world as a whole.